to our last session for today as part of the International Roundtable Conference, Urban Refabricating Allies, Re-fabrication Urbanism 2022 by Urban Allies Faculty of Architecture, Sinbagon University. And now it's time for a very special session by our keynote speaker, the expert in the political economy of urban design, Associate Professor of the Development Planning Unit, Faculty of the Built Environment, University College London, Dr. Catalina Ortiz. Areas of intellectual inquiry include the territorial and relational nature of urban space and political economy. And same as every session, we will wrap up for 15 minutes with the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Dr. Supicha. So, an our honor to welcome Dr. Catalina Ortiz.
Hey, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be with you. And I'm very thankful for Supicha inviting me to this very exciting space. I was listening very carefully to the previous presentations, and I was very impressed with the work that you are doing. So the students and staff alike are doing really very meaningful work. So I'm very happy to see that. And that's why whatever I'm going to say today resonates a lot with that sensibility that you have already shown there. So perhaps I'm already preaching to the converted, but somehow I think today I want to share some of the reflections that I've been having in terms of defining or redefining rather what urban design is and could do, and also showing you a few examples of the work that we've been doing with our students, but also myself in terms of my research projects. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen because I tend to talk a lot, so I will please ask you to stop me if needed. So I'm gonna start timing myself so we can be on time and have space for the Q&A. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about the title of this conversation. And this idea of urban design otherwise, in a way, draws from this quote, or rather the summary of a very interesting strand of debates and conversations and proposals that are coming through this idea of the otherwise. So thinking otherwise is another way.
So sorry for interrupting,
yes.
Because the color palette, it's still pop up, maybe with a keynote program. Sorry.
Right.
Do you see on your screen on the right-hand side? Okay. The colors.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. Let's try it.
Thank you so much.
Now, can you see it better?
Yes.
They disappear.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me see. So thinking otherwise is another way of thinking against what runs the great modernist narratives. It locates its own inquiry in the borders of systems of thought and reaches towards a non-Eurocentric models of thinking. I think the discipline of urban design in itself has been growing and has been, in a way, been shaped a lot by the values that underpin this, let's say, this very Eurocentric prism of thinking and acting on the world. And as we know now, we are facing a moment of emergency in every single way. We are witnessing a massive destruction of the earth, and urban design then is taking place in a context where there's an urgent need to think differently about our relationship with the planet. But as well, urban design practice and practitioners are also being part of a broader social discontent that has been taking place in many different contexts with different political regimes, but with one single claim that also connects all these struggles and social discontent, that is the idea of dignity, right? How to live with dignity, and to what extent then we have to think how urban design can also contribute to that, and in what terms to do so. There has been massive mobilizations in many parts of the world that disagree with the way in which the governance of many countries is taking place. We have been witnessing and experiencing the hurdles of very rising right-wing damaging politics and politicians that has been grounded in ideas and ideologies of white supremacism. It's not alien for any of us, all the racial tensions and violence that has been present for over many centuries. But now there's a special moment of turning point where there's no longer silence about the atrocities committed by this type of ideology. And there are very also helpful and hopeful movements across the planet, particularly the ones that are thinking from a different perspective. And in that way, feminist mobilization has been moving the public agenda in many places, particularly in Latin America, trying to think of what would it be then if we put life at the center instead of death, which is what the system that we have now is actually promoting. And of course, it's not new, and we've all been in this moment. The pandemic is then just a byproduct of the system that we are living in, right? It's not a coincidence, but it's rather a confirmation of how sick our planet and our society and our paradigms are. And of course, and we have seen in the projects before, that we can no longer think that urban design can be just relegated to the, let's say, to the materiality of a space, but that now more than ever, the digital sphere holds a great potential for actually reshaping the public sphere in the digital realm. So we're witnessing a moment where we are also trying to, I think I hear some echo, so maybe someone needs to turn off the microphone. We are witnessing a moment where we are also trying to kind of stitch again what is our understanding of the world and what is going to be then the role of urban design in this process of re-stitching and reweaving how we think and we frame about our relationship with the world, and what is then the role of urban design in it. And here in this piece of art is written in Spanish, the dominance of the cultural Western paradigms, and how can we reimagine and rethink how this takes place. And all this to say and give some context to this premise that design is always political. And sometimes in many schools, and I know that is not perhaps not the case in yours, design sometimes is understood as a neutral tool, but we have always to think the political power and the agency that design has, not only to improve the life of people, but also of proposing also different political projects. So therefore, something that we need to ask as designers is who owns what? Who owns the city? And therefore, how can we take a stand in answering that question, and what could be, again, the role of design in doing and changing that. I'm going to be just skipping quickly this conceptual part, because perhaps that would take us more time that would steal a little bit of time of the cases that I want to present. But part of the title of my conversation today includes the idea of how we kind of think the relationship with the spatial justice that is so central to the project of urban design, as I have been arguing. But what does urban design has to do with the spatial justice, right? So we live in a planet where we have many cities where we can experience entrenched spatial inequalities. This is a picture we had when we did, unfortunately, our last fieldwork in Yangon. And I'm very, very sad that this experience of going there is no longer available for us. So I also send my prayers to my very loved colleagues there. We are living in cities that have a hyperbolic urban transformation. The pace of change is massive. And in that way, we also really need to think what is our relationship, not only with space, but also with time, with that acceleration that the racial capitalism has, with this very appetite of transform and extract value of land. But cities don't exist on a vacuum, as we know. And I think it's very important to understand what are the geopolitical spatial impacts. This is an image I took in Havana, and there you can not understand the realities of this investment, for instance, in this beautiful, amazing city that Havana is. If you don't understand, for instance, the blockade that the US have had for over 60 years. Our realities, our urban realities are always interconnected with the political situation of the world. We know now more than ever that we are all interdependent. And of course, cities and urban design then is not an exception. And also we are living in places, particularly in global South cities, as we very well know, in contested urban governance schemes. There's not a straightforward state and the governed, but we have multiple powers and governance structures that are, in some cases, like for instance, in the case of Medellin or in Colombia, where I come from, is not that straightforward who governs, right? There are also very other armed groups that are not state-led, and that makes things very complicated in order to have even the power to transform directly or have one single incidence in the transformation of the space. So something that it needs to be very clear is that urban design and designers as well, and so we have to be self-critical as well, we've been complicit in the production of the spatial configurations of privilege, right? We've been complicit also in deepening inequalities rather than amending it. And I think that is something that now is the time to be rethinking the role of urban designers. And that's why part of my passion and my obsession is precisely to think then what could be the pedagogies and the ways in which we engage differently in terms of thinking an urban design otherwise, an urban design that unsettles the status quo rather than perpetrating it. So for me, we cannot understand urban design if it's not contextualized or placed in a broader set of forces and dynamics that also determine what can be done and in what terms, and what is kind of the famous role of maneuver in each one of the places. So you cannot talk about urban design without understanding this interplay between the space, power, and knowledge, and how those are look very different according to the process of urbanization, how the machinery of capitalism is working in any place, and how the healthy, the democratic systems are in every place. Of course, all this needs to be very contextual. That's why in my definition before of urban design, it's always very context-laden and context-dependent. And I think that is something that we cannot think, because we have to be careful in just generalizing or giving kind of claims of universality. And I think something important for me at least is that shifting that perspective of what and who is an urban designer and what design can do needs to shift from of the status quo of an autonomous discipline that is market driven, that is solution based, that is where the practitioner is placed as a figure of authority, only an authoritative knowledge, whose knowledge is the only one that counts to take decisions, to a more transdisciplinary field that is more concerned about socio-spatial action research, as some of the beautiful examples before, that needs to be politically grounded and engaged with practice and practitioners. So we cannot think the designer in isolation, but always in connection to the other actors that make the city transformation possible. And therefore you need to be a more critical and reflective interlocutor and facilitator rather than someone that is the famous or the genius creator that knows it all. But I think if you see in the bottom, you can check some of the narratives of the mainstream ideas of what urban design could do in terms of being iconic, world-renowned architects, or the stardom that sometimes and many times do more harm than good to the local communities. And something very important that also resonates with these perspectives of otherwise or a more critical stand with the Eurocentrism is understanding that we need to be thinking about the global South more as a vantage point, and that we need to change our relationship of the hegemony of the North paradigms. And I think we need to be thinking more in the intertwined connections of North and South, and we cannot longer remain silent as well as about the colonial legacies, what it does to us, to our imagination, to our ability to transform the way we design and think differently about how to have more just cities. The other thing that I think is fundamental is understanding that the so-called informality or the self-built neighborhoods and places are nowadays, and it will be in a couple of years, it would be the majority of where majority of people live, and therefore is the prevalent mode of urbanization. So we can no longer ignore that that is also a space and a site of design innovation and human agency. And if we change that premise of, instead of considering the so-called informal settlements a nuisance or a problem, but part of where we are actually really need to find where the multiple ways of understanding and framing design innovation, then we can change radically how, for instance, housing policies operate and how the master planning operates, and how we need to unsettle and change the ways in which we see the city in order to transform the ways in which we can intervene in it. And conceptually speaking, I think it's very important for me that we cannot see or detach the search of the spatial justice that is at the core of what I believe is a transformative project of urban design, without understanding the other dimensions of justice, right? The distributive justice, the epistemic justice, restorative, procedural, racial, deliberative. And I think I really like your projects that have at the center also the engagement with communities and different organizations, because you cannot really produce anything if it's not in relation to or with the different organizations and people. And I think here it's very important to think and stay attuned of what are the other struggles and to what extent design can help to other broader, political claims that are in the sphere of the public. And therefore, I think this idea of the colonial thinking that has been already for a while around, and that is now in a way more in fashion, I think that help us to think differently, and somehow design and urban studies are just catching up with this new strand. Of course, every region of the planet has its own version and its own relationship with the colonial impacts and coloniality in the disciplines, in how knowledge is produced, in what are the assumptions that policymakers have in order to make or not make urban transformations. And I think it's very interesting to see to what extent we need to be, questioning how knowledge, authority, economy, and even our own subjectivities are, part of a byproduct of this modernist, Eurocentric project where design was, in a way, born of. But it's our task to actually reimagine it, as you are doing with your excellent projects. And I think some of and I'll be quick in the more theoretical part, help us also to think that coloniality operates in different levels and are all interconnected and are all expressed in the space, right? So from knowledge to power to being are all expressed and manifested in our cities. But that's why we need to think and change, in a way, the lenses we use to understand urban transformations and what is the role and the cracks in the systems to actually produce change. I know we are a bit of, I'm just trying to see timing myself. I'm not gonna go deep here in each one of the concepts, but I think there's one key element about this decolonial thinking, And it's how we can start looking for the linking from the master narrative of the West. And how can we actually be more insurgent and trying to talk about epistemic disobedience that rejects that the 0 point of the West is what has been, giving us or becomes the canon of what design is in this case, or what it isn't, right? So in many places, what global South practitioners do could be just craft, but what Northern practitioners do, then it's art. Like, what are the standards, what we're measuring against, and to what extent then by challenging these premises, then we can imagine, a world otherwise that we urgently need. But there's also a lot of interesting work that is also even configuring a new field called critical design that is connected to the debates about post-development. And I think ideas of the pluriverse that are, challenging and more, or exploring what can we learn from more counter-capitalist projects, and to what extent we consider designers the people that actually designing their life projects. And I strongly recommend the work of Arturo Escobar, who's bringing a very interesting take to design and critical design in particular. And some of you already were mentioning this, and this is coming, from the 70s, and it has a long tradition about participatory action research. And sometimes we overlook some of the pioneers in this field, that in this case is Orlando Falsborg, that it was a Colombian sociologist that was really, helping us to understand that any research project or design project we take is a political act in itself. Where we go, what fonts do you use, how you express it, it's a political act. And because I'm an educator and a firm believer that education is the most powerful tool to transform the world, we need also to learn from these ideas of counter-hegemonic pedagogies. And I think ideas of Paulo Freire are very central to understand not only what we do within the classroom, but how we think the city also as a learning project. And that's why I hold very dearly these ideas about that are coming from critical education. And something that comes more from this idea of the decolonial thinking is trying to think or reframe how we understand that the processes of knowledge or knowing our cities is a process that is, bodily political practice, that we are embedded in it, that is very, subjective, and that if we understand research as a process of finding empathy, then we are changing kind of the terms of the game, because we are not looking, rent-seeking endeavors with urban design, but rather building empathy and transforming also relationships as part of the mission of urban designers. So I'm going to be speaking quickly about 2 projects that have been helping me to think through how all these ideas, become concrete and can be expressed in particular projects. So the first project that I'm going to refer here, it's trying to think about storytelling, right? What are the stories we tell to ourselves, and what are the stories that we are as a collective creating about our cities? And I think sometimes we underestimate the role of the narratives and how, that shapes also the collective psyche. So in this project, I'm using storytelling for challenging the best practice circulation. We have a fetishization in a way of the best practices, and planners particularly and policymakers are looking always for what works, right? Without fully understanding, the context, the enabling conditions, but also the side effects and the untold stories of that intervention. So something that I've been exploring a lot is the idea of how can we recenter the role of urban stories, also as bridges with epistemic justice. And when I talk about here epistemic justice, I refer in terms of the distribution and the recognition of other knowledges, right? And particularly the inhabitants, who are the ones that shape the city, and as we know as well, and to what extent these knowledges have been sidelined or not fully recognized by decision makers. And that's why I'm very interested in exploring and testing different critical urban pedagogies to leverage the visual, the digital, and the performative power of the storytelling. So quickly, this is a project I did a couple of years ago in Medellin. And for some of you that are familiar with the discussions and debates about the so-called slum upgrading, the city of Medellin has been sold as a paradigmatic case that have been able to address in tandem both informality and violence. And there has, every time that the transformation of the city and the strong role that design, architecture, urban design and planning has had in the city, there's always a story of the savior, of the mayor that was able to do the job, right? So that's part of the story, of course, because without political will, you cannot really do much. But as well as thinking of who has the right then to shape the story of the city. And I was trying to map out who's the gatekeeper of the story of the transformation of the city. And as we know, the city is a byproduct of a polyphony of actors, but to what extent in this map of the authorized story spreaders, you can see that there's nobody that really has been, affected also, or has been criticizing this model. So here I was interested in understanding how can cities across regions then learn, because I'm a firm believer that all cities need to learn from across the experiences of others in a more horizontal way, and therefore trying to explore what if we use transmedia storytelling to actually having a more encompassing perspective of multiple stories about the city and not only the official discourse about it. So in a way, what we're proposing was a reframing of that and trying to think of what is the power of stories also to teach, and what has been the central role of storytelling in planning itself. And if you look at the literature on planning, you could see that even planning is considered, as part of a performative account, and planners and urbanists in general also part of the authorized storytellers of what needs to be the future transformation of a city. And I think something that is very interesting that Leonie Sandercook has told us is that the way we narrate the city becomes constitutive of urban reality, affecting the choices we make and the ways then we might act. And I think that is very, seminal in terms of understanding also kind of that symbolic dimension and discursive dimension of it. So storytelling helps us to foster empathy, to understand the meaning of complex experiences, and to inspire action. And I think that part of inspiring action is very critical, and you in your projects been also exploring that. The proposal then we did was, we call the project Convite, which is a word in Spanish to refer to these gatherings of neighborhood upgrading through cooking publicly, in the public space, but also to gather collective action to actually build the spaces of the commons in the city. So you could see there, particularly the role of women in the care activities, and a lot of gender components that I'm not going to refer now here, but we cannot overlook that in the construction of neighborhoods. And these are practices that are named different in different places, but this is kind of the core collective action that is producing the city of the majority in the global south. And I think this is kind of precisely what has been overlooked in the stories of, in particular, the Medellin transformation, right? As something that is an heroic process where the state was the solution provider, but that overlook completely how actually for decades have been, people themselves trying to sort out basically the provision of all the elements. So the Convite project was trying to use storytelling for urban learning and trying to think then in how to get together, right? How to develop strategies for togetherness. And because the cooking and the eating is a very important part of the bonding experience, trying to use also the metaphor of recipes to try to think then, if planners always want the recipe for urban transformation, let's see what is the recipe that we've installed and what are the other recipes, what is missing in that recipe. So the cooking analogy helped us a lot for the strategies and experimenting with our participants and trying to see then how that connection also can help us to enable collective action. So in this project, we partner with several organizations that, as you can see in the logos, from multilateral agencies to very grassroots organizations, members that we gather together in a series of workshops for over some time. And what we were producing or proposing there is trying to build a network of urban storytellers. And this label of urban storytellers was also our strategy to, in a way, level up a bit the power asymmetries that are always present when we bring together often adversarial actors in the same place. We developed together the contents of a beta version of a transmedia platform, and we're trying to understand what a transmedia is and do and can do. And as a process of that, we also end up developing, and I saw someone also producing a toolkit to actually go deeper in understanding how to use storytelling for urban learning, but particularly to address kind of the 10 dimensions that are involved in Islam upgrading strategy. So very tailored to what are the needs of upgrading and to what extent we need to actually work in combination of those 10 dimensions in order to do a really comprehensive territorial strategy. And in this toolkit, we kind of focus a lot in the ways in which we get together, right? And how we use storytelling for doing so. So we can see there the bonding strategies, the story of the self, right? How each group was telling their story, and what is the story of the us. So what are the stories that we can actually do together in order to envision the city we want? And what are the things that we can do to actually actionate those visions? And something that we prepare here and that we found out and learned from the practice itself of the convites, of being in the streets, you know, with the collective kitchens, is that the kitchen needs, what if we understand the kitchen as a learning environment? And then what are the main, you know, the wisdom holders there that most likely would be the elder women of communities, right, as a source of wisdom? And what are all the affective relationships that you forge with that? So we involve our participants, right? We have here, for instance, the director of UN Habitat at Latin American level, a previous minister, with the community members, with the professors, you know, so like all these hierarchies are in a way broken when we all cook together, because it's another set of expertise that is required there, right? Another sensibility to connect. Working together, trying to think ourselves as urban storytellers, making the connections. She's, for instance, the former Ministry of Housing of Brazil, you know, mingling with people. Here, the other part was thinking of stories as learning devices, and then how to translate that passive knowledge that community members have in something that can be palatable also to other actors, and vice versa. And there we use a lot the visual narratives of the untold stories, and trying to gather and see what was missing in that story of the city. But also, how can we build a visual urban alphabet to actually use all the jargon that urbanists have, and sometimes that use and throw at people without really explaining or finding a common ground for a better dialogue. Memories, you know, the role of memory and trying to think kind of the long-term impacts of the transformation of places was something very central to this work. And therefore, the other element here to tell a story of the collective that brings together all the different actors, was using these recipes, as I said, as a form of collective storytelling. We use and push this metaphor, trying to bring different groups, mixed groups, to tell us what are then the things that are missing in the recipe, or what have we learned that becomes a recipe that nobody knows, but maybe we need to bring to the table. And these recipes for urban transformation, of what it needs, what are the roles, what are the flavors that are needed, was a very playful yet serious conversation. And of course, the playfulness needs to be present. It needs to be fun. It needs to be beautiful, as you know, and Supicha, wisely lead you to engage with. So crafting these collective stories. So we developed, and I can share with you some of the tools we did to do this, in order to think through the lenses of, for instance, here, a community member, for instance, what is the role of care and who takes care of the carers? In this case, all community leaders, women, that oftentimes get completely ignored in the urban transformation processes. And the use of transmedia storytelling, you are more familiar than I am, you are younger and know all the power that it has, and how then the ecology of media is essential for us to bond, but also to start creating, a set of even archives of urban knowledge that sometimes are hard to find. So we work trying to understand what is this story, how each one of the groups would explore audiences, channels, and formats, and to what extent we can learn from where people actually come, get their information from, to actually adapt, urban planning and urban design, I'd say, outputs to be disseminated. And all this strategy of dissemination is also a design problem. It's part of the design, and oftentimes we don't really look at that in that way. So we designed this immersing space of looking at almost kind of this 360 thing where you can move around and do click in each one of the characters and then begin in each of the characters' story, and also material associated with that. So for instance, how you mobilize the stories. In this case, this is the lady that it was kind of the main carer of children in one of the neighborhoods we were working with. And so how we use them in different formats, from community radio to analog printed elements, to immersive aspects of going around, walking tours, to all the social media platforms that you are more familiar than me. So if you're interested in this project, you can follow us at Coinvite, and you will see more material there. The second example I want to show, and I think we're still on time, is a project called Living Heritage Atlas. So we were building our connections to do actually on the ground co-design and co-creation processes. But of course, we were hit by the pandemic, so we need to actually think of how can we do it online, right? And how can we still gather and produce things now with the challenge of being totally, disembodied. And something that it was important for us in this project was kind of the premise: what if, instead of thinking informal settlements or self-built neighborhoods as a problem, what if we consider them the living heritage of the city? And therefore, how can we demonstrate that, showcase the legacy that these different places have for the city, right? And so we thought, okay, let's do an atlas, right? That way you can capture and map out all the richness that a territory has. So we were basically a network or a collection of over 60 people working in 13 countries, where one of our premises was that it needs to be an intergenerational learning. So we had more senior people from the different organizations that we partner with, but also our students that were spread all over the world in different time zones, and all the challenges that implied. But something beautiful that came out, despite all the disappointment of not being able to actually live and experience and eat together and have fun, it was expressed by one of the community leaders, that he said, actually, we're all equal here. We have the same space and the equal amount of tools to actually mute ourselves. And so somehow that comment that he made me think like, it's true. That's one of the, the silver linings, if you will, of going and moving a bit to this digital format. And the framework we use to actually operationalize the idea or the notion of living heritage has like 4 components or 4 lenses. So we claim that living heritage is a tool for rethinking urban futures, right? That you cannot really think the future if you are not grounded in understanding the lessons of the legacies that already exist, as you've been pointing out in some of your projects. And the idea of systems of care was very central. Of course, where we are, and ideas of care, the role, the gender, unpaid work, and all the strands that care has now is in the public agenda. And I think that is one of the key lessons that the pandemic has taught us. And therefore, design needs to be thinking of how to address care, right? What are the infrastructures of care that design can actually foster, as well as memory and migrations, and what are the cultural expressions. And in the place that we were working in the neighborhood of Moravia, it's a place where, unfortunately, because of the very violent conditions of the context, there has been a lot of forced migration, and that has been a place where forced migrants have been, hosted and have been welcomed. One of the few places where they can stay there, and therefore the connection about memory of those different places, and the journey of migrations and the pains and the hassles of migrations is something central to understand who and what are also the baggages of the participants or of the community members that we were dealing with, and what will we learn from that, and how that becomes part of the elements that help us to actually propose strategies of a spatial intervention that are grounded and respect also the legacies of the trauma that many of our community members and participants had. And therefore, of course, the layer of ethics of engagement is absolutely essential here. The other point that we were analyzing is the idea of use. And here, because this neighborhood had a very interesting relationship with waste, because it was a rubbish dump of the city, the economy of the place is very connected to recycling. And I think the recycling economy, it's something to look at. And it's, now that we are talking about the climate emergency, this is one of the, the entry points where design needs to also find a wider expression. And I feel that we're getting there, but not fully. So here we did some work on that. And finally, the other strand that we worked was around community communication. And we really dig deeper in the communication, what were the networks, and trying to understand how people connect in moments like of the crisis of the pandemic, for instance. But of course, as we know, and unfortunately we still are kind of in this moment, there's a sensorial deprivation, and the digital inequalities still exist, are there, and even though we try to minimize that, it was also part of the challenges, right? So what are the sensibilities then that needs to be taken into consideration when we are talking about these spaces and these screens that have potential but also limit a lot our sensorial experience? So in this process, I'm not gonna go through all the contents we did, but it's just to give you a little bit of the flavor of what we were doing, so we have more time perhaps to do some Q&A. I think something that I've been really thinking about, or very putting a lot of attention, is how do we foster pedagogies that create these new infrastructures of care, and how, to my surprise, even with the distance and being all spread in 30 countries for doing all this exchange with our friends from Medellin, one of the community members said, we hope to give you son a hug with the body, the soul, and the heart. So even despite, you know, this disconnection and this embodiment, there's also the generation of bonding and connection. So what I've been arguing is that even this co-creation in the digital space also create new affective cartographies. And as you see this in this image, some of our participants were still touching each other even when it's not possible physically. So here the role of storytelling comes into place again. And what are the stories that design help to, you know, amplify, and what are the new narratives that design is able to convey? So here we talk about the story, you know, in tandem, the stories of individuals, collectives, and places, and how, for instance, you know, one of the community leaders told that we are actually having a conversation with the territory, and being online then help us to focus on that. So in the first image, you see how we were able to really understand the story of the place through the lenses of the story of the community, the women community leaders of the place. Or, for instance, also the story of the recycling system and the recycling economy through the lenses of the story of one plastic bottle, and try to follow the bottle in order to understand who wasn't making all the roles of collection, of transforming, and to make it something that can help to the livelihoods of community members. The other aspect that we focused on was in the territorial memory, and to what extent, you know, a lot of the work of the designers is actually becomes a collective curatorial practice, right? What do we add in terms of finding and understanding, a shared understanding of the trajectories of urban transformation in order to give us, you know, grounds to think about the future? And how can we then create an open source or a commons archive, right? Those are kind of also the questions that we have to be thinking ourselves as designers in terms of how we democratize the access to urban knowledge, right? How we make people actually get interested in this in terms of informing political action. And here you have just a few examples, and I also can share broader information about the strategies that came out of this. But I was more interested in showing you the process, kind of the backstage, rather than the outputs, to see how the inventory of practices and knowledges help us to actually ground the interventions that we all propose together, and actually be more attuned with the realities, sensibilities, and the factibility of these interventions. And something interesting that also came up, because we were, as I said, dealing with population that is coming from different places and has, you know, many, you know, struggles, is the territories, memories, and foodcapes. And I think the foodscapes coming up every time, trying to understand also how the production of food, the circulation of food is essential also to create community bonding and acceptance. And one of the projects that I didn't have time to put here is precisely a mobile kitchen that actually allows to do something more than eating, let's say, right? So I think how we use these devices also to disrupt and generate more things is also very interesting. But because we were actually interested about how can we have a transformative dialogue across actors, and how can, in a way, translate from, let's say, a more tacit knowledge to a more codified knowledge, but also how can even have the common terms, right? That oftentimes is the source of a lot of the disputes and the misunderstandings that happen when we are negotiating, for instance, urban projects. So we did what we call a reparative glossary. And we went through each one of these dimensions, working across actors in actually saying, okay, when we say welcoming, what do we mean by that? Or when we say displacement, what do we mean by that? Right? So we kind of come to terms of what were actually the terms of the conversation to actually try to have a common ground and have a more productive dialogue. And sometimes in design, we overlook this, but I think it's part of also generating a very more meaningful part of the process of a negotiation, of a participatory process. The other element that I think has been central in what I think also encompasses an urban design otherwise is thinking about what I call the distributed public engagement strategy. And in that way, as you have also shown us, how can we also think in tandem our design strategy in conjunction with community media, urban journalism, and the collaborative platforms. So here you can see, for instance, how we, as part of our design strategy, design also podcasts, social media campaigns, engage with a lot of the alternative media, but also trying to cater to this kind of new branch of journalism that is urban journalism. And I think that is something that we still need to explore more, and that is part of the future, to have also, as you know, more broader exposure, but not only exposure, but also trying to bring to the public arena and the public debate the type of change that we want to see in the world. And here you can see also the example of a wiki, and how we will start thinking of how then a wiki page could be in a way part of an archive that is public, that is in the commons, and that is accessible to anyone. And that, as I was saying, is just part of the vehicle that we use to have political incidents, right? We, in the craft of our design process as part of the co-creation, we were also very strategic, as you are, in terms of developing, a designer that are also politically savvy as an essential component of being let's say, a good designer. So we were involving city councilors, UN Habitat, the global platform to the right to the city, the civil servants that were, actually trying to support eviction threats in the neighborhood that we were playing, working with, and different NGOs that do advocacy that can help us also to amplify the message. So I think it's not only about the process, but how you reach out, because if you don't have the political horizon of activating, the call to action, then many times a project, then it cannot have, hold on the public sphere. And I think how you have incidents in the public sphere is a very serious component of urban design, and we cannot overlook this component that oftentimes when we get a depoliticized notion of design, then that is not part of, let's say, of our menu. So what we did as part also of the impact of what we create with the generation of the Atlas was also having a decalogue for Islamic grading in pandemic times. And we were able to bring together, maybe it's too small, the line of logos, of very, heavyweight institutions to actually back up as a public pronouncement of the ministries at Latin American level. So we were able to actually escalate and try to make impact also in the spheres of public policy. So we are always, moving across different spheres, but going to the public policy one is a very important one of what I think is a more transformative process. This is just an example of one of the layers of the website that we also did, and a lot of the videos that we did. So there's a lot of components there. But also we come up with some artifacts, also learning from the place, the measures of the place, how the domesticity scale operates in the neighborhood that we were working with, and how then our partners, that was a cultural center, a collective of architects, and a grassroots organization that advocates for the right to stay put in the place, would be using these devices that we all designed together to actually trigger spaces of discussion and debate and further their own, participatory processes. So in one, for instance, it has been used to actually point out at issues of waste and how, recycling needs to be more at the forefront, or how to bring together children and so on. So I think even if these small mobile devices seem very naive, I think it holds a lot of potential also to what is able to trigger based on also the dissemination of all the work we did, right? Because I think the dissemination process of the work is even as important as the work itself. So to start wrapping up, because I don't want to, yeah, we're on time. I think the urban design otherwise needs to contribute to shift the narratives of what urban transformation have the power to do, and therefore is a precondition for new spatial imaginations. So just to remember, storytelling brings together other ways of knowing, and transmedia helps to amplify and have impacts in other also ways of doing. There are this idea of urban storytelling and urban design otherwise question the existing geopolitics of urban knowledge production and circulation, help us to amplify the narratives of often silence perspectives, is territorial and relational, right? It's built in tandem with people and organizations that even if they don't love each other, we found pedagogies and strategies of bringing people together. And it's powerful because it links emotions and reason, and therefore it points for an imagination of future action. And I think those are kind of the key ingredients of an urban design otherwise. So just to conclude, I think we need to be reframing our ideas of urban design more as a co-produced urban design, when it's an open-ended negotiation process that is incomplete engagement of urban agents, where the urban becomes a space of the multiplicity of struggles to shape a collective project that the city is. And then design then is a tool, a methodology to actually help us to achieve the spatial justice. So thank you so much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Wow, thank you so much, Catalina. I feel like I'll be back to London. And I think we have about 15 minutes for the discussion. So if anyone have any questions, just please, send it in the chat box or in the webinar chat box or anything. That's fine too. I have a little problem with security guard. Okay, but you have been opening our eyes to a very wide perspective of how to be the urban designer today. But I mean, for me, because I've also studied in the same kind of school of thought with you, but are we the mainstream or are we the marginalized group of urban design? What do you think?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think we also have to kind of acknowledge our own privileges, right? So I'm actually speaking to you from the belly of the beast, right? So I'm speaking to you from London, which in many cases, was the producer itself of all, the colonial empire project that still exists and outlives, the colony. Yesterday, we were having one of the walks with our students in a new project that we're embarking that is called Diasporic Geographies. And I think that speaks, so looking, through the voice or through the lenses of the multiple Souths that the North has. So in a way that helps us kind of to answer your question, right? I think we're always pivoting from, being the mainstream in the sense that I'm sitting in a privileged position from a privileged place and an Ivy League university. But at the same time, I in my mind, I like the metaphor of the Trojan horse, right? That you come with your beautiful smile, but then you
need to have hope at least.
Absolutely. So we were actually walking in the south of London to see how the transformation of ethnic cleansing has been happening of both Black communities and Latin American communities as a byproduct of the renewal or redevelopment projects. So we were walking through those places with practitioners, urban designers, and alumni of us that are shaping different, ways of understanding urban design. So an urban designer also is part of the activist, but urban designer also is part of the creative force that can transform the sense of place. So I think in that pretty much they were at the margin of the mainstream, but at the same time, pivoting in that. So I think it's not either or, but I think it's both according to the movement and place.
Yeah. And I think nowadays it's really complex, isn't it, to be an urban designer? I mean, on one hand, you have climate change, and then you have inclusive city, and then you have smart city, and then you have creative cities, and things have to be political correct. But in Thailand, we're still in the city beautification paradigm. I mean, it's such a big gap between the theoretical discussion and practice. How do you see it? I mean, because you work also in London, but also you have a lot of practice in the South or in Asia. Or do you think things are changing, or are the gaps still quite wide, quite big?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just mentioning our friends in Yangon, right? And then if you see that case, it's like, oh, we have all to cry. But because I'm a hopeful person, practices such as the one that you saw earlier with WITI and ACHR, and CAN, those are very, very powerful practices that are just right there. So I think, that's why I think the way we look at things, right? Like what lenses do we use? And I think if we see things are happening and there are massive amount of new ideas, and that force, that impetus for social change is present everywhere and is finding different channels, right? I mean, some regions take different places, it takes different shapes, but I think we are in a historical moment. And that's why it's beautiful and amazing, because we have a huge responsibility. But I think the new generations, when you see the projects of your students, for instance, when I see my alumni or my students, I think that's the hope we have. And that's why I believe in education, right? In the power it has to deliver, new, more sensitive practitioners. So I'm not naive, but at the same time, I see that change is happening at many scales. And I think that's where we need to be catalyzers of that change, and to be having our magnifier glass to try to be looking for those that are doing things differently and that can help us, to scale up and magnify that way of seeing the world and transforming it.
Yeah, totally agree. There is some question from the floor asking that, could you please suggest how urban design could be responsive to a decline of local economy, street life, and indigenous community?
Well, that's like a huge question, but I think it's the right
Ph.D. thesis, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So I'm not an economist, because then that's why I think, we need to insist a lot in the transdisciplinary nature of it. Here in London, for instance, there's a very interesting organization called the New Economics Foundation. And I recently supervised a dissertation on high streets and how can you take on board a democratic approach to economy through the lenses of what you do in the high street, right, on the main streets. Of course, this in the context of, Global North. But then if you see, for instance, the work of WeGo, that is working with informal economy and informal vendors, that work of that the organization has done is massive, and they are not urban designers. But we need to learn to work and learn from them, because there's plenty of spatial implications of the decisions of how you deal with it, like, for instance, with informal vendors that are pretty much the soul of our cities, right? And that in the beautification efforts, they are seen as the dirt of the city rather than the soul of the city, right? So I think there's a total shift. So I think we need to learn and work more with the ones that know how the economy works. And of course, that is one of the key, questions of our times. How do we, recover the economy? I mean, I do a lot of research in Latin America, and, I have to read all these policy documents, and, all the numbers that the economies love and do suggest that the poverty rates have been going back 30 years, right? How do you recover economy of the loss, of the massive loss of, what has happened in 30 years? So we are now seeing, chronic hunger as one of the key problems, right? The byproduct of poverty, and how chronic hunger becomes something, step one to even talk about economy and livelihoods. So I think all the issues about food sovereignty and all how can we, produce our own food, it could seem alien to this time, but actually it needs to be central, because those are, the life-threatening elements of life nowadays. And I think design needs to be putting its efforts there, because I think that's a serious, a serious challenge that cannot be resolved, with designers alone. Because we really need the ones that help us to understand how the economy works. So I'm not answering your question, because I think we need to learn from the ones that are working in economic reactivation. And to what extent, I think that the big challenge now is the ones that want to go back to normal, right? So in a way, business as usual. So the ones that thought things were okay because perhaps they were the winners of that game. Or how can we take this historic moment and think, okay, maybe the economy needs to be rethought, and maybe we are looking at something very different, and that's why it needs, a paradigm shift where we are actually, working, for an economy that takes care of life and sustains life and care rather than extraction, and pretty much, having people as disposable people. So having, some to thrive at the expense of some others that are really exhausted and depleted by the system. So I think those are the big questions that are involved when we're talking about activating local economy, right? We can escape of the big question.
But I really agree that we are in a historic time. So either we go back to the same, which is hardly possible. I mean, I think this COVID thing is hijacked so many things already. And another question from the audience, because you also mentioned about the virtual reality. I mean, the future of the urban planning. I mean, it seems a bit like fantasy right now, but in 10-year time, do you think it will affect something about urban planning? Because it seems like we need less space in reality, or what do you think? Or we still lack of human interaction and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old school in that way. I like people. I like to eat and have fun with people on the ground.
Yeah, me too.
But we cannot deny that there's a lot of, the very concept of work and labor, right? For the ones lucky enough, as the privilege of us that can work from home, the job, the labor relationship is going to be completely altered, right? A lot of colleagues are trying to understand what happened with the financial districts that got empty, right? So there's a lot of spatial implications of the pandemic that put us a lot of challenges. How I was having an interview with someone asking me about the transformation or the impact of the COVID in London, and I was like, What if we think the city, the financial center of the city, as a space where we can reclaim affordable housing, right? That you would never think of, because it could be completely the antithesis of the financialization of housing. But I was like, well, we can throw that idea out there. What is more, there's more pressure for having affordable housing than office space at the moment, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So I think our relationship with the digital needs to be there. But first of all, digital literacy becomes an issue. Digital literacy across generations, right? When I explain my example of the intergenerational exchange we had with our colleagues, we had to work a lot in, teaching on how to use Zoom and Mural and all these things. And that cannot be underestimated, The cost of data, the monopolization of the, the companies that provide internet providers, we ended up paying more of, data use than to the economic compensation of our participants. How come, right? That is insane. So yes, we have to engage with the digital, but we can overlook this digital divide that exists so badly in many places. So that, yes, but how and to what extent? And I would say we have to engage with the digital, but I wouldn't agree that it needs to be at the service of this paradigm of the smart city, which I don't believe at all in it.
I think that would be last question from the audience. Because in Thailand at the moment, we are so crazy about smart city. And there's like a critique that will the city be too smart for the people? Or how can we, balance a smart city and smart people? How to balance that and how to make it inclusive? Because everywhere you go in Thailand right now is smart city 1, smart city 2. And it seems like the only one way of smart city, which means the technology. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have to disclose my bias. I don't buy at all anything about the smart city. So of course we need technology to enhance, our living conditions. But if you don't really go to the roots of inequalities, for me it becomes a distractor, and just to provide more power to the usual suspects, right? If you go even to the genealogy of where the smart city initiative comes from, you are going to see that it's IBM, the one saying, we are the technology providers and we have the solutions to all your problems. And guess what? That's not really true.
Yeah.
So I don't really buy it, but it's, it has a lot of seduction power, right? Because if you're a policymaker and you say, you have this software that is going to sort out all your problems and the technology is our savior, then I was like, yes, I'll buy it, because it's an easy, quick fix, and it needs to, it's hassle-free, because then you have a contractor, most likely a white male that speaks English, that is going to deliver that.
Yeah.
And then we are all happy. But guess what? That's not where the people is. That, we were talking about chronic hunger, informal economies. That is where is, the priorities of the city life. They don't need yet perhaps another app. Maybe they don't need more sensors in the city. Maybe, sometimes also bring with a package of a lot of surveillance and violations of privacy. So there's a lot of things that haven't been discussed, because for me, if you ask me, the Smart City project is a biopolitical project of control of their citizens and not to address inequalities. And any project that is not fighting against inequality, I'm not interested in being part of.
That's very clear. Oh, it's a pity that we run out of time, and I wish we can meet like face to face, because we are old school. I wish we could like go shopping in London together and go eat and dinner.
But hopefully soon. Hopefully soon.
Yeah, hopefully soon. Yeah. But
I really
much,
want to go. I really want to go to Bangkok. It's one of my favorite cities, I have to say. And the food is the best.
Yes, it's the best. So we're looking forward to have you here face to face. Thank
you so much
you.
for having me. Take care.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Catalina.
Bye.